The only light in the room was a small kerosene lamp, its tiny flame flickering stubbornly against the encroaching shadows. I remember staring at it with an intensity that bordered on desperation, simply because I didn't know where else to cast my eyes. Downstairs, my wedding dress lay folded neatly over a chair, a silent, white witness to the day's irreversible end. Through the floorboards, I could still hear the distant, rhythmic clink of dishes and the comforting rumble of my father's deep laugh as the last of the guests departed. Beside me, on a sturdy bed he had built with his own 2 hands, sat my husband. We sat in a heavy, expectant silence, 2 teenagers pretending we possessed even the slightest understanding of what the word marriage truly entailed. My name is Rebecca, and I grew up within the strict, traditional confines of the Old Order Amish in Lancaster County. My life was defined by the unwritten rules of our faith, where certain truths were meant to be felt but never spoken. This is the honest story of that hidden world, the parts we were never allowed to whisper out loud, until now. I was merely 17 when I stood at the altar, but in my community, that wasn't a cause for concern. It was the standard. In the Amish world, our formal education ends abruptly at the 8th grade. At 14, your textbooks are closed forever, and your schooling shifts from the classroom to the field and the kitchen. From that moment on, my education was purely practical, centered on the labor required to sustain our way of life. I learned to sew modest, plain dresses, tend to a dozen younger siblings, and cook massive meals for community frolics that lasted from dawn until dusk. By 16, the transition into womanhood accelerated through Sunday night singings with the youth group. That is where courtship quietly takes root, tucked away in the shadows of barns and the rhythmic clip-clop of buggy rides. What outsiders rarely understand is how rapidly life moves for us. It is designed to. Our Ordnung, the unwritten but ironclad code, ensures that dating is never a casual exploration. You don't see where things go. Every gesture is a step toward a lifelong commitment, a path laid out long before you have the chance to truly know your own heart. My courtship lasted less than 6 months, a whirlwind of tradition that left little room for doubt or discovery. We practiced bundling, an ancient custom where we lay together fully clothed, atop my handmade quilt in my childhood bedroom, with the door left slightly ajar, and my sisters whispering and giggling in the next room. We talked for hours in Pennsylvania Dutch. We spoke of the sturdy house we would build, the livestock we would eventually buy, and the many children we hoped God might grant us. He would hold me with a firm but careful arm, and in those moments, the future felt like a predictable, safe path. Sometimes he kissed me softly, but the first time his hand lingered tentatively at my waist, I froze. It wasn't a lack of affection for him, but a sudden, cold realization that I had no map for the boundaries between innocence and sin. In our world, no one ever sits you down to explain the line. You are simply expected to feel it in your bones. We were 2 young people expected to navigate the depths of human desire with no compass, guided only by the heavy silence that surrounded the things we were never supposed to mention. By the time our wedding was announced in the church, I felt both chosen and trapped in a single breath. I was chosen because he had picked me from the singings, a sign of belonging and worth in our small world. Yet I felt trapped because once you are baptized, and I was, there is no turning back without the devastating weight of Maidung. To leave is to lose your family, your heritage, and your very identity in an instant. Our wedding was held on a Thursday in late fall, just after the harvest, when the earth turned cold and the work moved indoors. I woke at 4 a.m. to begin the massive task of cooking for the community. By midday, nearly 300 people filled my parents' house and barn, their voices a low hum of German and laughter. During the hours-long ceremony, the bishop preached about Gelassenheit, the act of yielding, of wives submitting, and of building a godly household through obedience. I remember sitting there, my hands clasped in my lap, thinking that while I could bake 100 pies or milk a cow in the dark, I had no earthly idea what was going to happen once the sun went down. After the massive feast of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and shoe-fly pie, the last of the guests finally began to depart. The house remained thick with the scent of wood smoke and coffee, a familiar comfort that felt suddenly alien. My cheeks ached from hours of performative smiling, a mask I had worn to hide the growing knot in my stomach. Quietly, we retreated upstairs. To be honest, I was beyond exhausted. My body throbbed from standing since dawn, but as the bedroom door clicked shut, that fatigue sharpened into a cold, piercing fear. The room was austere, a simple wooden bed, a handmade quilt stitched by my aunts, and a wash basin with cool water. There were no mirrors to catch my reflection, and no locks on the door to offer a sense of security. Privacy in an Amish household is a fragile, fleeting thing. I could hear the heavy thud of boots moving below us and the occasional scrape of a chair across the floorboards. When he finally loosened his suspenders and whispered, "I don't really know what I'm doing," something broke open inside me. I realized he was just as lost as I was. What followed was not the sweeping, cinematic romance people often imagined. It was slow, hesitant, and marked by a physical discomfort I hadn't been warned about. We moved with an uncertainty that bordered on fear, as if we were both terrified of breaking something sacred or inadvertently crossing into the realm of sin. I lacked the vocabulary to ask the questions burning in my mind, and the silence of my upbringing felt heavier than the handmade quilt above us. When I gasped, he stopped immediately, whispering, "Are you all right?" It was a moment of profound vulnerability, brief and awkward, yet tender in its own fragile way. Afterward, the room fell into a deep, ringing silence. I lay there staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows from the kerosene lamp dance across the rafters. I didn't feel like a woman in some magical, transformative sense. I simply felt the gravity of a definitive line that had been crossed. He eventually rolled onto his side and pulled me close, his face pressing into my hair. "We'll figure this out," he murmured, his voice softer this time. In that moment, listening to the horses shifting in the barn outside, I chose to believe him. The next morning, the world remained stubbornly unchanged. I woke before the sun, tied my apron strings, and went to work. There were cows to milk, floors to scrub, and guests finishing leftovers in the kitchen. No one asked how the night had gone. In our culture, intimacy is private to the point of total silence. It exists primarily for procreation, and pleasure, especially for a woman, is a ghost of a topic, rarely acknowledged and never discussed. I realized then that the Amish world grants you the immense responsibilities of adulthood without providing the emotional tools to navigate the intimacy it demands. I eventually left the community at 22, and the cost was immediate: shunning, unanswered letters, and a door that was forever closed to me. In therapy, I finally learned words like autonomy, boundaries, and consent. I learned that understanding your own body isn't a sin, it is an education. I grieve for the 17-year-old Rebecca who lay under that quilt, trying so hard to be brave. Adulthood isn't just a collection of chores and vows. It's the ability to know yourself before you promise yourself away. I wasn't too young to cook for hundreds, but I was far too young to understand the true gravity of love.